Okay, she set me up for this because I have no art, music, or theater. But at one point, I was doing theater in this room right up here with one of my doctoral students, and we had a lot of fun with it. And it was it emanated from my work with women who have survived abuse as children who were in despair. And so anyway, I appreciate that there's a home for this kind of dialogue. So I have a paper, and I'm going to use my paper because I don't normally do this, but because I want to stay on time so that the most important part of this hour will be our dialogue. But I'm more comfortable here right now, to be honest with you, because I have a paper. But I wanted to start with a story of my little 7-year-old granddaughter, Hannah. So she started second grade this year. So the week before school starts, you get to go with your mom or dad or both to see the teacher and meet the teacher. So you're not walking in class the first morning seeing the teacher for the first time. So she had her visit with her mom, and she contacted me and she called me on the cell phone and said, "Granddaddy, my teacher has teacher energy." And so I want to tell you, I love this nurse energy. Even from Ray, I love this nurse energy that's in this room. So I am very happy to be a part of this. So I want to tell you, so you're going to probably walk out of the room when I start this, but I'm not here to tell you anything you don't already know. And I'm really not here to tell you what has been or, what is. But I'd really like to share ideas with you about what could be. So my point of view is this. We're all engaged in creating stories, narratives of who we are and what we're about. And they reside in our consciousness, and I think they manifest in who we are in the world, what we do, how we act. And so I also believe that as we live these stories, we gain new understandings, new dimensions, new storylines from the intersection of our stories with other stories. So our stories, our narratives evolve and change. So I see this as our personal narrative coexisting in this sea of collective, tribal stories, if you will. And I think nursing is a tribe. It's a community all of its own in many ways, and yet it also resides in a larger group of tribes and so forth, as we know. So all these collective stories shape our individual stories that we choose as nurses. For many of us, our personal narratives coincide pretty fluently with this collective narrative of nursing. So I'm a nurse. I nurse and see nursing through these stories. And I believe these stories reflect themselves in this flow of patterning. I'm a unitary person, so I see these stories unfolding in a unitary patterning. And they come forward in a variety of phenomena. But I want to be clear, you can't reduce this experience to any of these phenomena. But we are experiencing simultaneously the world physically, physiologically, mentally, emotionally, socially, culturally, spiritually, and even mystically. So these are all expressions of who we are in our wholeness. So I take inspiration from the African novelist Chimamanda Adichie and her TED Talk. I've recently just fell in love with TED Talks. So Adichie claims that our lives, our cultures, are composed of many overlapping stories. And she tells the story of how she found her own authentic cultural voice in her TED Talk. I encourage you to listen to it. As you know, TED Talks are about 18 minutes in length. She warns that if we hear only a single story about another person or country or whatever, we risk a critical misunderstanding. So it is that I've come to believe that through nursing, I found my authenticity. And through caring, I've found my empowerment as a nurse. I too believe that there are many overlapping stories of nursing, and that if we hear only a single story of nursing, we also risk a critical misunderstanding of our possibilities as nurses and for caring. There are many narratives of nursing, and I don't wish to critique them. That's been done sufficiently, I think, in the literature. I'd rather like to draw our attention to a few narratives that might help us with our dialogue about how novel caring, what I'm trying to purport, which I don't have a really organized fully, this notion of novel caring might create a new narrative of nursing, or for nursing. So one predominant narrative, which coexists with many others, is this narrative of effectiveness, nursing effectiveness. And you see this expressed in the literature of nursing and healthcare. You see it in institutional vision and mission statements. My own institution that I work for, Chamberlain College of Nursing, has a very robust vision and mission. You see this expressed. You see it in purposes of organizations. You see it in standards of practice, and particularly in regulatory criteria and accrediting criteria. So the significant themes in this narrative have to do a lot with measurement, with metrics, with methods, and outcomes. It's a storyline that concludes that nursing is really significant, and it's significant in changing healthcare generally, and specifically the lives of people, as well as their families, groups, populations. So as you know, sometimes this narrative is directed toward populations, like more recently veterans, the elderly, and so forth. It's a narrative that places nurses strategically in a position of influence. I don't think that's a bad idea. Another narrative of nursing that's been emerging over the last decades is the narrative of human wholeness and the avoidance of nursing that might fragment the human experience, and particularly nursing that would disempower the freedom of choice, the voice of the person. So there are variations on this narrative, and some of the stories in the literature you see titled as integrative, holistic, unitary, and I also think the emancipatory literature speaks to this. I think most of you in this room know this narrative very well. I have this personal version of this story myself that you can see in my work, and I call it unitary appreciative nursing. So this narrative, this broad narrative that I'm describing, challenges storytellers and believers because there's a very well-intentioned movement, not only in healthcare, but in the United States and the world, to take the guilt out of mental health. And this is done by attributing mental health situations to physiology. So the recent suicide of Robin Williams has evoked this discussion. So I pulled this from a news outlet website, and I quote, "Depression is not a bad mood. It is a biological reality and a medical condition, and when we talk about it as anything less than that, we belittle the people suffering from it." Another even more bold headline from a highly regarded medical journal were these few words: "Depression is in the brain." Then we come to the nursing narrative of caring. Obviously, I don't need to spend a great deal of time talking about the caring narrative. But it runs along the lines of viewing caring as knowledge that is a substantive domain of nursing. It guides practice. Although universal, it expresses itself uniquely in nursing, with nurses serving humankind in the co-creation of well-being. And this is done through, in Boykin's narrative, through the intentionality that's a grounding force. It manifests itself in different ways, implicitly in shaping nursing. And as I said, explicitly, you see this in the co-creation, the dance, if you will, between nurse and person. So, it is caring that generates unity in the midst of many paradoxes of the human condition. Now, there's another narrative that we're very familiar with, and that's Watson's narrative of caring, and it varies a little bit from this, but shares a lot of the viewpoints. But specifically, Watson's account of caring suggests that there's a centrality of loving kindness and equanimity, presence, cultivation of spiritual practices, being the caring, healing environment, and allowing miracles, which I absolutely love. So going back to Adishi's warning of the danger of a single story, I'm also wary of a single story of a narrative of nursing. A single story admittedly gives power to those promoting that story. As Adishi describes it, it's impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. She relates this to an Igbo word. I hope I'm pronouncing these correctly. I need to learn when I use language of other cultures to say them, so my apologies. So she relates this to the Igbo word nikali. It's a noun that loosely translates it to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nikali. How they are told, who tells them, when they're told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Further, Adishi claims that the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. What I'm proposing is to expand our imagination in regards to how the narrative of nursing as caring might intersect and redefine broader narratives of nursing that go beyond the single story. And by the way, there is a promotion of a single story in nursing through all of the criteria and the standards and the uniformity of practice. I'm actually suggesting that this be embarked upon through being novel. That to imagine the caring narrative in novel ways, such that it interacts with these narratives of nursing, to expand the horizons of what caring can be for nursing and what caring can offer people who are the recipients of nursing. So an example, so there is already one intersection that's been emerging, and that's the caring, healing, or the caring, unitary, transformative narrative. An example of this story narrative, you can see it very clearly in the University of Minnesota's description of the Center for Spirituality and Healing. And interestingly, they call this a traditional narrative, which I tend to agree with them. We just have kind of rediscovered it over the several decades. Historically, nursing is deeply rooted in a tradition of caring and healing. While contemporary healthcare has created obstacles that often make it hard to provide holistic care, patients and their families are yearning for it. This is from their website. Millions of nurses around the globe are drawn to practicing a person-centered, relationship-based care that incorporates the use of integrative or complementary therapies with conventional care, the intersection of two narratives, and is focused on advancing the health and well-being of people, communities, and organizations. That's from their website. And it is claimed that integrative nursing has the potential to strengthen and invigorate the profession. So novel caring would be a kind never seen before. Fresh, new, original, innovative, breaking new ground. The purpose of novel caring would be to create new ways of thinking, neoteric thinking, that would evoke new narratives of nursing. So what I'd like to engage in is a dialogue about what novel caring would look like and what new forms it might take and how this would expand, illuminate, and enhance the narrative of nursing that is in accord with the caring agenda of human well-being. It could start with our personal narratives of novel caring and embrace collective novel caring. So I'm suggesting a process that does not attempt to overcome another narrative, but rather to take this narrative into the eye of the caring narrative and create a new vision. So what if we took, for instance, the narrative of nursing effectiveness and brought it into the eye of the caring narrative? This could evoke novel caring that pushes the boundaries of nursing effectiveness. So I want to give you one exemplar of this narrative, the common narrative on nursing effectiveness, from the literature. So in a 2013 study of the effectiveness of nurse practitioners, using data from articles published from 1990 to 2009, 11 aggregated outcomes were summarized. Outcomes for NPs compared to MDs, or teams without NPs, were comparable or better for all 11 outcomes reviewed. A high level of evidence indicated better serum lipid levels in patients cared for by NPs and primary care settings. A high level of evidence also indicated that patient outcomes on satisfaction with care, health status, functional status, number of emergency department visits, and hospitalizations, blood glucose, blood pressure, and mortality are similar for NPs and MDs. So if we embrace this narrative and thought about how novel caring narratives would address this effectiveness narrative, which I think is impressive, by the way, we might, one, pose new questions of the data. Could caring have been a factor in all of this? If so, how was it a factor? We could consider outcomes that expand beyond these, that are more relevant to the person-centered notions of uniqueness and wholeness in human life. We don't abandon the intent of the narrative, but we change the narrative, the storyline dramatically. Expanded narratives of nursing and caring have created novel ways of knowing, such as Boykin's application to nursing education, Watson's application to heart health, and Smith's unitary transformative caring framework. Caring becomes novel when we take our personal narrative of nursing and courageously create novel caring narratives. How am I doing on time? I'm a little nervous about it. 1 minute? Okay. She had these big signs, but I'm not paying attention to them. Okay. So caring becomes novel when we take our personal narratives of nursing and courageously create novel caring narratives. So for me, this has taken on the form of unitary appreciative nursing. But this started when I was a young boy. I was 15 years old. My sister was a nursing assistant, and I was sort of lost. I knew that I had these feelings. At the time, I didn't have a label for them, but I discovered later the label for it was being gay. But I felt very isolated as a teenager in the 1960s. So I was this kid who went around the school on my own and had no friends. So my sister said, why don't you go to the hospital and work as a volunteer? And I said, I'm going to ignore the comment, but anyway. So I said, no, I'll do it. I took the training to be a candy striper. This is 1964. So anyway, I didn't go the whole first semester. So during Christmas holiday break, it was a cold, rainy night, and I was like bored, and so my sister was going to work, and she said, come with me. So I dressed in my candy stripe uniform and went there. And I fell in love with nursing, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what to call it. So what is fascinating for me is I spent a year and a half, and by the way, I skipped my fifth and sixth classes, so my grades were in the toilet, but I would skip and go to the hospital to work. So the director of nursing called me in one day and said, Richard, after like a year, how would you like to be a nursing assistant? We can pay you, because you're coming in anyway and doing all this stuff. But anyway, and then one day, a group of nursing students told me that I could be a nurse, and I was like, no, I can't. There are no men who are nurses. Men don't do nursing. And they said, yes, they do. So I was the second man in Virginia to go into nursing. But my point is that I fell in love with what I saw nurses do, and that was this connection to human beings. So that's my personal narrative that I bring in to this narrative of caring in the broader narrative of nursing, and you all have those too, and I think they're relevant. So if you can bear with me for one more page. So going back to Adichie, the African novelist, she says, I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity, it makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult, it emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. Novel caring in its greatest expression would be just this: what if we chose to engage fully all the stories of nursing in all its expressions? What if we realized the consequence of a single story of nursing is that it diminishes our dignity as a community and the diversity of those we serve as well as one another, and fails to account for the equanimity of nurses regardless of their stories? Novel caring might create a narrative of nursing effectiveness that would be founded in the answers to these questions. And this is my model of nursing effectiveness. Have I seen underneath the disease or the condition I have been educated to diagnose, to the person who exists struggling to deal with this disease? To what extent have I appreciated and embraced the role I play in bettering the lives of others and my own life? How much time have I devoted to listening to the story that my patient longs to tell me, in contrast to the time I required him or her to answer my health history questions? Finally, how often have I remembered that my heart is as great a guide to action as is my brain? Thank you.